Welcome to this so-called Flight 2 follow-up video. Today we're going to do some engine failure scenarios in the diesel engine Diamond DA40NG, and we're going to play in the area around Moses Lake, Washington. The primary mission for this series of videos is to demonstrate the basics of how controllers can understand and themselves do some flight simulation with various engine failure scenarios, learn some lessons. We'll be doing this in VFR conditions with calm winds. As mentioned, we're in the Diamond DA40NG in the vicinity of Moses Lake. For the record, I'm filming this on October 12th of 2020. Standard caveats, including that this is not real flight instruction. There's a number of things I'm doing that are not correct. I'm trying to drill down on specific principles here, and the opinions expressed in this video and throughout this course are my own. For the record, here are the flight sim settings that I'm using, the same ones that I have been using. We're going to do, actually in this particular one, about 3 or 4 immediately after takeoff, and you'll see what I mean by that. That'll happen real quick. We'll do a couple from cruise, and we're going to do one during a so-called late stage descent. In this particular one, that one, we will do an ILS approach, and we'll be doing it in visual conditions, but we'll actually fail the engine about 4-mile final on an ILS approach. I guarantee at least one landing on or near an airport, one farther from the airport, and one where the airport might be reachable. In terms of how I'm going to fly these, I'm going to fly these to what I call a variable private pilot level, and what I mean by that is I'm just not using all my advanced bag of tricks from over the years of research and experience. So I'm going to fly this more or less the way a typical private pilot seems to fly this during real-world situations. Occasionally I will deliberately fly more poorly, either with my stick and rudder skills or with some of my strategic decision-making. If so, I'll be doing that for teaching purposes, and I will announce when I do so. Finally, sometimes I'm going to go back and forth between pilot mode and controller mode. In other words, sometimes I'll be explaining to controllers what the pilot may or may not be thinking or looking at various points in these scenarios. Sometimes I'll be explaining what I think controllers should or should not be doing. Oops, sorry. Let's go fly, and now I can switch to the flight sim. All right, I'm going to bring the volume up here. I had it muted so you didn't hear the engine idling while we were sitting there. On the departure end of runway 22 at Grant County International Airport. Let me do a couple things to get started. First of all, I'm going to just flip-flop the comm frequency so tower's not barking at us. I'm going to set a custom view, so I'm just going to sit up in the seat, tip it down to where I can see the bottom of the instrument panel here. I'll set that as a custom view, so Control-Alt-1. I'll leave the flaps at the takeoff setting. Many of these GA airplanes you can take off with 1 notch of flaps or with no flaps. I've generally been taking the flaps up for takeoff. No particular reason. Here I'll leave them down as we play with a handful of these engine failure scenarios immediately after takeoff. I'm going to leave the trim where it's at, and I'm going to take the parking brake off just so we're ready to roll when it's time to play. I will mention something about this airplane real quick. There are a few airplanes that are on the market now that are diesel powered. They are, for all intents and purposes, diesel engines comparable to the diesel engines you might find in a Ford F-250 or something like that. In many ways, there's obviously some differences for aviation. One of the differences, as I move the camera and then kind of zoom in here on the gas cap on the left wing, you'll notice that there's a sticker here that says warning, and you have to fuel it with jet fuel, Jet A1. I'm just going to switch back to the view there. Diesel engines in airplanes run on jet fuel. I'm not going to get into chemical difference between jet fuel and diesel fuel, but they're actually similar enough that the airplanes that are run as diesels run on jet fuel, and that's good enough for our purposes. Please don't put jet fuel in your diesel pickup truck, but put jet fuel in your diesel-powered airplane. Doesn't really matter, except we lose some things like magnetos and the mixture control and some things like that. And in many of the diesel-powered airplanes, everything kind of gets controlled for you, and that's nice. For the record, though, and I will tip down the view a little bit, that means that you have this thing over here on the left for an engine like this, where it has an ECU or an engine control unit. It can go on channel A or B or automatic. That particular switch is inoperative as it's modeled here in the set. We can turn the fuel pumps on or off, but it's not going to make a difference as far as I'm aware here. Before takeoff, normally you would test that, and it cycles through various tests, but the ECU can fail, and the control unit is driving, you know, the particulars for this engine. It's a mechanical thing that's got pistons going up and down and valves and things. Those things can fail, or we could just run the darn thing out of fuel, right? For our purposes, if we want to shut the engine off in this airplane, we just lift the guarded switch and then shut the engine master to off. I'll do that right now. And when we do, you'll see that the load meter, which is just showing essentially the available engine power, is at 0%. That's not a surprise. This is a constant speed prop. However, the propeller is controlled automatically, so there's nothing we can do to adjust the pitch of the propeller blade. To turn it back on, for what it's worth, you turn the engine master on and then turn the electric master from on to the start position. That'll start the engine. We're back at idle now. In this airplane, it idles at about 4 or 5% load. So when I do a handful of simulated engine failures here on takeoff, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring the power back to idle, and I suppose technically we're making about 3 horsepower or something, but essentially it's the same as failing the engine for our purposes here. So let me just reset the view. I'm going to note one thing by looking at the airport layout for where we are at Grant County International. This is a chart we'll reference briefly later when we do the ILS to runway 32 right. We're on the departure end for runway 22. We've got 10,000 feet of runway. Runway 14 left, 32 right is 13,500. It actually has 3 other runways that, if you look closely, kind of look like they're in the middle of a taxiway. My understanding is that those are used for occasional military operation practice and are not normally used as runways, but technically they're there. So we're going to take off on runway 22, and I'm going to do like 3 or 4 quick engine failure scenarios, sort of playing with the long crisscrossing runways very quickly. We'll come back to this chart later. Let's go fly. So I did take the parking brake off. I'm going to leave the flaps at the takeoff mode. Trim is set where we want. Let's go full power. You'll see the load go up to at or close to 100%. By the way, the field elevation here is ballpark 1150. Like any airport, especially ones with long runways, it's not exactly the same at all points on all runways. So we're just going to lift off. We've got 10,000 feet of runway here. Lift off in a second here. We'll imagine, of course, that we're talking to Grant County Tower. We've been cleared for takeoff on runway 22. If the engine were to fail right about now with runway remaining, mayday, mayday, engine failure, and tower, you can clear the pilot to land if you want, but they're landing whether you clear them or not, and there's really no traffic to move because presumably the runway was clear already. So tower, you can clear them to land if you want, or you can just shut up. It doesn't really matter. But we'll just go ahead and kind of get going again. And now we've left a bunch of the runway behind us, so we'll kind of imagine that we've just taken off on a runway that's maybe 4,000 or 5,000 feet high, and we're climbing out. I'm going to target a speed roughly 85 to 90 knots. Not quite the top of the white arc speed in this airplane. So full power. The way to speed up is put the nose down. So oops, the engine just failed. They are too low. In a situation like this, there's one thing and one thing only I would want tower to say when the pilot declares the mayday. I would want tower to say, do not stall, do not stall, do not stall. So I'm just going to add power here, and we're going to kind of loop back around. Not loop, but swing back around. Somebody loses the engine right off the end of the runway. They are landing in a field straight ahead. The only thing towers should be doing, in my opinion, is reminding them, do not stall the airplane. And that's a reminder to the pilots. I call it the voice of God thing. Trust me, I wouldn't normally be flying over the buildings this low. I'm just trying to set up for the next quick scenario here. But that's a reminder to the pilot to not stall the airplane and to fly it under control into whatever field or whatever they're going into off the end of the runway. Okay, so I've got the flaps pulled up here. I'm going to make a slight turn. Get going on runway 32 right here in just a moment. And I'm going to start to climb. So let's imagine we've taken off and we're already starting to climb. If you remember a moment ago, I had said that the field elevation is ballpark 11 to 50, and that's good enough for our purposes. And this thing glides about as good as anything. 1650, let's do 1750. So that's about 600 feet, powered idle, and even if the pilot immediately starts the turn, I want to show you something. This airplane glides about as well as any of the others. And let's imagine this pilot is coming back to the same runway, that for whatever reason there's no crisscrossing runways or anything else. To come back, you have to make not merely a 180, you have to turn more than 180, try to get back to the runway. And this airplane glides well, and I didn't dawdle before starting that turn back, but it can be kind of tricky. Again, tower, you can clear them to land if you want. They're coming back more or less anyway. The one thing I recommend if somebody loses the engine shortly after takeoff is do not stall the airplane, and just remind the pilot to fly it under control. Okay, and I'm going to add power, and we're going to go around. So tower, you can clear them to land if you want, but the one thing I want you to do when somebody's at low altitude, within about 1,000 feet or so of the ground after the takeoff, and they say they've lost the engine, mayday, mayday, coming back or whatever, do not stall the airplane. Okay, so let's just kind of leave that alone. You kind of get the idea, and I won't demonstrate that we could have, because there are crisscrossing runways, pilot might, depending on the airport geometry, take off and elect to land on one of the crossing runways or even a taxiway. Again, you can try to clear them if you want. I suspect the pilot's going to do it anyway under their emergency PIC authority from 91.3, and by doing so, you can clear them if you want, but again, I remind them, do not stall the airplane. Okay, for our next scenario, I'm going to put it in slew mode just to kind of get set up for a second, so give me a second. I'm going to hit Y, which puts us in slew mode. I'm just going to tip the nose down a little bit, and I have some idea of what I want to do for this one. So we're just going to bounce up to about 5,500-ish feet. I don't have to be exact, but 5,500 feet at 60,000 feet a minute doesn't take very long. And we're going to go just straight out a few miles south, kind of south of town, somewhere about here-ish, and turn around as if we're going kind of northbound. You can see the airport over there. Okay, and I'm just going to set it up so we're going more or less due northbound, and we're not quite going over the airport. So I'm going to come out of slew mode in 3, 2, 1. So the Y key, and it might kind of bounce us around. And for this one, I'm just assuming that we're flying along at, ballpark 5,500-ish feet, just in cruise flight and so on. And suddenly the engine quits. I'm going to do that by turning the engine master off. I'll put the guarded switch back down. So, all right, the engine just quit. And the pilot does something like, okay, nearest airport, here's this nearest one. It's only 3 miles away. All right, so I'm going to go direct, enter. And by the way, the name of that is I'm going to Moses Lake. Some of you might have just figured out the joke as I killed the cursor here, so it's not blinking. Well, we've got 2 airports. A lot of people refer to the big Grant County International as Moses Lake, but it turns out, and can you see it down here? There's actually this little thing, and it's even sort of being drawn on the synthetic vision down here. This is Moses Lake Municipal Airport. So much for a 10,000-foot runway and a 13,500-foot runway. This one is 2,500 feet. I have seen real-world cases where pilots have diverted to one airport and controllers have thought they're going to a different one with the name, and the pilot and the controller aren't on the same wavelength with the name. So ultra quickly, and I'm just going to leave the airplane flying. I know of at least one real-life incident where this happened in the Riverside area. Let's go to the terminal area chart so I can zoom in better. Short version of a story, and I'm just letting the pitch trim fly the airplane, okay, for a second. Pilot was in the Riverside area, said, I'm diverting to Riverside, saw the big runway here in Riverside, so they start going to RIV. Well, Southern Cal thought they were going to Riverside, RAL starts coordinating, and that led to some confusion. All right, I'm going to come back in. I can just see the airport down there, kind of underneath, so I'm going to bend out. For what it's worth, this has a 2,500-foot runway, and I'm going to show you how you might take an airplane like this and put it on the 2,500-foot runway. There's a displaced threshold. Just very quick, I'm just eyeballing it. It looks like right about that taxiway, kind of a beam, that circle, whatever that circle is, maybe for a windsock or something, is the middle of the runway. I highly advocate, and this is what I would do if I was flying and had an engine failure in real life, I target the middle of the runway as my planned touchdown spot when I'm setting up. Okay, so we're just, you can kind of see it on the map over on the right side, MFD here. We're actually just past the airport. I'm not sure if we'll see it now that I'm in the left bank. Okay, you can kind of see it down there underneath the left wing. I'm going to set up with a left turn here, come out about a mile, mile and a half, so I have a decent amount of space from the airport since we're up high enough, and just fly a left downwind, come back, and land back to the north here. Okay, now this is 2,500 feet. Is this long enough for an airplane like this? Well, two common sense tests. Number one, controllers, are there GA airplanes that fly out of this? Let's say you're at Grant County Approach. Are you familiar with the area? You know, are there planes that fly out of here? Yeah. Well, if planes fly in and out of here, you can get an airplane in there. That doesn't necessarily mean that the runway is long enough with a lot of luxury. So here's a quick test. We're in a Diamond DA40, so controller's quick quiz. There's no exact right answer here, as I'm just also paying attention to the flying. What do you think, and I'm going to pitch trim nose up and just slow it down a little bit. What do you think the typical filed true airspeed is in cruise for something like a DA40? And again, there's slightly different variations, but if you have a DA40 pop up on your frequency for VFR flight following, let's say, what true airspeed do you guess they file for? Okay, probably I'm guessing you're thinking in the 130 to 150 range. By the way, I'm just eyeballing the angles. I'm looking for about there. I'm just trying to plan my turn. So about 130, 150 knots. We'll call it 140 as maybe your guess. Quick rule of thumb. Take the expected, what you guess is the filed true airspeed for that kind of airplane, multiply by 10, and that's really about the bare minimum that they could make. So this airplane, a 1,400 foot strip, is really, really tight, but it can be done. Yikes. Double that amount, so just take the filed true airspeed times 20. So we're guessing 2,800 foot, and that's more comfortable. And I'm just eyeballing the angles here as I'm talking. And I'm going to adjust the camera. I feel like I'm juggling 6 things here. But a 2,500 foot strip is definitely tight, but it's doable. And I don't have time to elaborate here, as I'm just going to reset the view and kind of trust that as we finish the turn, we'll be lined up more or less with the runway. I might have to make a slight adjustment here. A 2,500 foot strip, it's not a lot of luxury, but this is doable. By the way, we're coming in a bit flatter than we would with most airplanes. The Diamonds have these nice kind of long, thin wings, and they tend to glide fairly well. I am a tad lower than I would have preferred to have been, but at this point, we're just going to continue. I can make the middle of the runway, which is what I was planning. I am just a tad lower than I had wanted to. But as we come in, once I am sure, no doubt whatsoever that I've got the runway made, and I do that now, I'm going to go flaps 1, flaps 2, and now I will adjust from where I had planned to touch down, and I will try to touch down a bit sooner. As I flare for the landing, touch down, a little firm, hit the brakes. Didn't quite make that turn off there. But the setup was all to the middle of the runway. As I got closer in and I was guaranteed to make the pavement, then I added drag. For me, I ended up going out just a tad further than I had wanted, and therefore I didn't put the flaps down. Let me just get rid of that warning and the beeps. Until the very, very end. Frankly, I would have preferred to have been just a little bit higher, and then another quarter mile or so out and a little bit higher I could have added flaps and so on. But that gives you some sense of what the sight picture looks like coming into even a field that's 2,500 feet long. That's relatively short. Okay, let me set up the third one here, and to do this, I'm just going to leave the engine shut off. When we get flying, and you'll notice this, the prop hasn't stopped until we came to a stop. When you're airborne at flying speed, normally there's enough air over the prop that it will continue to windmill. If you'd looked at the load meter after I shut the engine off, it would have showed 0. So I'm going to go back to slew mode here for a second. So let's hit Y. Let's go up, and this time I'm going to go up to about 6,000 feet. Doesn't have to be exact, but ballpark 6,000 feet. And this time we're going to set up, we're going to go northwest of the airport about 10 miles to get started. And over here, you'll see it in a moment. There it is. This is the Ephrata, or Ephrata, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, airport right down there. For what it's worth, Ephrata, you might notice if you pay very close attention, there's a runway like on the ramp. Well, that's for gliders. We're not going to land here, but there is a lot of glider activity. It's pretty cool. If you look at the local glider rules, at least the ones I found from a few years ago, for at least some of the glider operations, they expect gliders to touch down right at the beginning of the pavement for runway 22 and be at a complete stop. They sort of kind of veer off at the end to the right, but get stopped within about 500 feet, and that's what they use for landing. What we are going to do is go on, and we're just going to kind of ignore this airport, and we're going to fly towards Grant County International. You can see some of the runway lights here and set up with a different scenario. So let me do a couple things as I come out of slew mode in 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to do a couple things real quick. So the engine is shut off. Step 1, I'm just making sure we're flying and kind of reasonably in trim. Step 2, I'm going to program the GPS to the nearest airport, and I'm going to skip Ephrata or Ephrata. Set up Grant County International, hit direct, enter. And you'll notice we're about 9.4 miles away, descending through, and I want to get the flaps up. Sorry, when I first put the flaps up, we're going to sink for a couple seconds, but this will improve the glide. By the way, flaps up or in the 0 position, where there's a couple airplanes where the flaps can actually go a few degrees negative, flaps up or 0 degrees is the preferred place to have the flaps for almost all gliding situations. I'm not going to try to describe the exceptions. Okay, so we've got an engine failure. For our purposes, we're assuming that there is no Ephrata airport here and that our pilot is trying to make Grant County International some miles away. So real quick, controller, when the pilot declares the mayday, again, you can clear them to land, but they're going to, if they make it, they're going to land anyway. What are you going to do? Deny the clearance? You can maybe move some of the traffic. Remind them to stretch the glide, do whatever checklist they need to do. I'm going to skip that step here in the airplane. But one of the things that you can do that's very, very helpful is start to assess if you think they're going to make the airport. So what I recommend, and you're going to have to be quick with this, but use the tools that we have. I'm going to use the GPS as a stand-in here. So let's watch as it ticks to 7.5. They're at 4,900 feet. Okay, so 7.5 as it ticked over was 4,900. Let's real quick do this maybe in half-mile segments if we can. So we were at 49 at 7.5. The pilot reports that they're in a stable glide. 7, and we're at about 46. We're losing about 300 feet per half mile. Let's check that again as we get to 6.5. By the way, I'm aiming for the very beginning of the pavement for 1-4 left. But as we tick down to 6.5, I'm using this as a stand-in for controller radar depictions. 6.5, and we're about 43. Maybe not quite. So we're losing something like 550 feet per nautical mile. So real quick, and try to do this live while this airplane's gliding in. Do you think they're going to make the airport? Well, let's see. They're coming up on 6 in a moment. So they're 6 out, 6 times about 600 feet a minute. So they're going to lose 3,600 feet. Well, 3,600 feet, and they're just going through about 4,000. We're going to be at about 400 feet, real quick. Okay, what's the field elevation? Ballpark 1150. Well, we're going to land 700 feet underground, except for one fact. Very quickly, I'm just going to let this continue gliding. Okay. Think about the airport layout. Where's the airport exactly? What's the 0 point? And the short answer is it's the approximate geographic center of all usable runways. So it's somewhere about where the big runways cross. So actually, we have about 1 mile less to make it to the pavement. In other words, as I'm doing this calculation, this is going to be close. Now, here's one of the things I'd like you to think about. If we calculate that the airplane is at least going to be, and I'm just laughing at the Bing Maps picture of an airplane in flight. It looks like it's on the ground there. Over to my left if you're not looking at where the mouse is. If we calculate that they're going to be 3 miles short or more, I suggest we tell the pilot as soon as possible that we calculate it appears you're going to be about 3 miles short, say intentions. Okay? If they're definitely going to make the airport, I advise controllers to shut up unless we're telling them, just trim for best glide speed, run your checklist kind of stuff. Okay, I would not tell the pilot, it appears you'll make the airport. I think that is problematic. I don't have time to explain here. But what if it's going to be close? What if they're going to be within a couple miles or maybe reach it? You know, because remember the actual point that GPS is measuring to, 3.8, is probably down about here. We got about 1 mile less to get here. This is going to be awfully close, folks. All right. Well, here's the thing. If they're going to be close, there's a temptation that pilots have right now, and that's a thing known as to stretch the glide. I'm going to stretch the glide, and I'm going to purposely fly more poorly than a pilot would in real life. So I'm going to exaggerate a little bit. So I'm pulling the nose up. We're at 0 power because we got the engine failed, right? I'm doing this with pitch trim so I can keep it kind of stable. But what happens if somebody just is worried, they're stressed, they got the adrenaline, they know it's going to be close? Okay, what do? Subconsciously, they start pulling back on the stick or the yoke more and more and more. And when you do that, what's happening to our speed? Our speed is decreasing. And right about now, okay, we are below our best glide speed. The best glide speed is the speed that gets you the best angle over the ground in calm wind. We'll talk more about winds later in the course. For now, I want you to learn about how this works with calm winds. Okay, but the way this works is by flying at a slower speed than optimum, we've worsened our glide angle. So if we would have been able to glide from some altitude AGL, maybe 5 miles, now we can maybe only glide 4. And so there's two problems with what's known as stretching the glide, which pilots are taught. They've heard that phrase. They might not remember it in the heat of the moment. This is the benign version right here, where the pilot, because they're stretching the glide, is making their glide angle worse, and now they're more likely to end up short. Okay? I'll show you the worse version of stretching the glide in a moment as we get real low and we get into a real kind of pucker factor as we're not sure we're gonna make the runway. Okay, and Flight Sim does not model this super good in this airplane as far as the aerodynamics, so I'm gonna do it this way. I'm gonna start pulling more and more and more and more, and I am exaggerating so that you can learn, but as we pull more and more and more, what happens? We just stalled the airplane, and then a stall spin is something like this. This is not modeling it correct aerodynamically. Oh, that wasn't good. I do have crashes turned off, so you didn't get something that's going to show a crash or whatever. I'm going to hop in the drone. Pardon that I've parked the airplane upside down. But here's what happens. And I'm going to bop up. I'm going to spin around and kind of show you, just kind of eyeballing the angles, what's going on here. So a pilot is maybe out somewhere like here. Again, if they're high, we can just remind them, best trim for best glide speed, use your checklists, or advise us what checklist you're using. I would not tell them the airport's reachable. They can see that and they'll maneuver as necessary. If at the same altitude, they're farther back and we calculate that they are not going to make the airport by about 2 or 3 miles, okay, I would advise them, it appears you're going to be about 2 or 3 miles short, say intentions. Okay, and that way the pilot has an early chance to decide, all right, where am I going? I mean, look at my options and figure out where I want to try to land this thing off airport. There's the airport. If it's going to be close, within about 2 miles or so, what I would like Tower to do is remind the pilot, do not stretch the glide. Now, in physical space, as I kind of maneuver forward and come down a little bit, okay, they may or may not be in a location where they'll be able to make the runway. But if they are going to make the runway, and I'm marveling at another airplane over here, if they are going to make the runway, by reminding them, do not stretch the glide, you are helping them as much as possible, because you're maybe at least giving them a chance to resist that temptation to pull the stick or yoke back and make the glide worse. And then especially down low, okay, as they get into kind of a real dicey situation and they're thinking, uh-oh, I'm not going to have it made. So let's suppose that they're here, and I'm just eyeballing the angles here. From here, I'm just telling you, even the DA40 is not going to make this piece of pavement, okay? And so what happens is, if we're reminding them, do not stretch the glide, do not stretch the glide. At this point in the real world, if we don't remind them, it's entirely possible that the pilot's just going to pull more and more and more trying to get to that runway and is going to stall spin and die right about here instead of keeping it under control and landing here, which is dangerous, they're going to stall spin somewhere back about here or whatever. If you tell them, do not stretch the glide, do not stretch the glide, and they kind of recognize, all right, I've gotten to where I'm really low, I have no choices, at least they have a chance of maybe diverting to this field or wherever they might want to go. But in summary, if they're short, tell the pilot it appears you're going to be 3 miles short, say intentions. If they're going to be high, shut up about whether they're going to make the airport or not. If it's going to be close, maybe a little short, remind the pilot, do not stretch the glide. I would be in favor of saying that 3 times or so. All right, for our last one, let me escape end because the airplane ended up upside down. And we're going to set up for an engine failure about 4 miles or so out on an ILS to the runway, and it didn't save that, so I got to type it again. Pardon me. Grant County International, Moses Lake. We're going to take off on 14 left, so we're just departing in the reciprocal direction. We'll go south a few miles, turn around, and then come back in to do the ILS approach. So good, good, good. I like the time, flight conditions. Let's fly. Very quickly, and I do have the approach chart pulled up. We're just doing a super quick simplified version of this. 109.5 is the frequency, 324 is the approach course, and this is saying 2800 for the intercept altitude, about 5 miles out. We're going to go just a little higher up, and that way we'll intercept a little farther out. So we'll go to 3000 MSL. That should have us intercepting about 6 miles out. So give me a second to get this set up. So I'm going to keep tower from barking at us. I'm just going to sit up, tip the view down. I'm going to hit Control-Alt-1 to save this as a custom view. I'm going to go ahead and put the flaps up for this one for takeoff. Leave the trim where it's at. Parking brake off. And let me set the radios up real quick. I'm going to go Control-1 just to zoom in. So Nav1, I'm just going to set this to, what did I say, 109.5. And that should come up very quickly as India Mike Whiskey Hotel. I'm going to set the CDI up to receive the localizer, and it's already set 327, which is the GPS expected value for that course. Don't worry about the 3-degree discrepancy between the 327 and the 324. Either way, the localizer is fixed in space, and this will indicate properly no matter what. So don't worry about that. That does not affect the flight in any way. And we are going to go, so let me just get it rolling here. I just want to get us started. And for those of you who, for whatever reason, haven't seen what the cockpit indications look like on an instrument approach, right now you can imagine, because we're on the runway center line, we're basically tracking the localizer quite well, and that's why this green line is all centered here. We are flying it the wrong way. We're doing it as a back course because we're going outbound right now. But because this particular instrument is what's known as an HSI, this indicates correctly. So the green line is centered because we're on the center line. If I purposely go off to the right for a second, which means that the localizer signal is centered over here to our left, you'll see that this thing is to the left. If I cut back across real quick, we're going to cut across the runway center line. You'll see the localizer. We're going through the localizer right now, and it's back off to the other side. So I'm just going to go out here. And for this one, I'm going to speed up the sim rate. I wish they had a little thing that showed you when it's sped up, but I'm going to hit R. And then to speed it up to double speed, I'm going to hold down Control and hit the plus key over on the numpad. So we're now at twice normal sim rate, 4 times the normal sim rate. So we're just going to go out here a few miles. This is imprecise flying at 4 times the sim rate. I'm just trying to approximately get the localizer centered outbound and get to about 3,000 feet. This is kind of nuts. All right, and I want to go out through the glide slope intercept at 3,000 feet, and that guarantees we're about 6 miles out, so I'm not trying to track this directly. We've climbed up a little bit above it. I'm going to come out of the fast sim rate, so Control minus minus. The trim's got us climbing. We're back at a normal sim rate, and I'm going to bop back down real quick. I told you I wasn't going to fly this airplane the real right way, as I kind of zoomed down to 3,000 feet. I'll come to the right to get the localizer centered outbound real quick. And we'll do the ILS approach here in a second. So, all right, localizer centered as I do some wild maneuvering. So we're tracking it outbound. We're about 3,000 feet. And we should be at glide slope intercept. Any moment. Right now we are well above it. You can tell because the green diamond is underneath us. So I'm going to get the autopilot on. So autopilot on. I'm just going to real quick hit ALT for altitude hold mode. It grabbed 3,200, which is where we were roughly at. And I'm going to zoom in for 1 second. I'm going to center the heading bug. So I'm going to synchronize the heading. The heading bug is correct. Now I'm going to put it in heading mode. So the autopilot is flying the airplane in heading mode and holding 3,200 feet. I'm going to go down to 3,000 as we're going through about the glide slope intercept. So I'm just going to set the altitude down to 3,000, vertical speed, 3 clicks on nose down, about 300 feet a minute. So it's going to do 300 feet a minute until we get to the 3,000 feet, which is altitude selected. It's white because it's armed for altitude select, which is 3,000. And I'm just going to do kind of a quick procedure turn back with the heading mode. So I'm just going to do this kind of a quick, fast, and dirty way here. I'm just real quickly going to turn to about a 100-ish heading, taking advantage of the fact that we're already off the localizer a little bit on the east side. And as soon as we get to that east heading, I'm going to swing it back around. I'm going to park it here for a second. I really want to get to where we're about lined up with the localizer. I think if I've timed this right, that'll track us in nicely. But I didn't want to swing the heading bug all the way around because otherwise it would have turned to the left once the bug was on the left side of whatever our exact reciprocal was. So now I can move it back around to about here. I think that we will make this turn and intercept the localizer momentarily, and then I'll show you what I'm going to do with the autopilot. In the meantime, with the autopilot flying the airplane, throttle is now controlling speed, and I want to start slowing to 90 knots. I'm just going to bring the throttle back and try to get to a speed or a power setting that's going to get us to 90 knots. We're going through the localizer. I'm going to keep the turn going. We were in just a little bit tight on that turn. So I'm going to set the heading bug a little past, trying to get back to the localizer being centered. You can actually see the airport in the background in the synthetic vision. Okay, the autopilot's going to level the wings in a second. We are underneath the glide slope because the green diamond is above us. That represents the glide slope. Localizer's coming in. I'm going to go ahead and hit the approach mode on the autopilot. And when I did, it does two things. For lateral steering, it changed to LOC for tracking the localizer. It made a very quick juke move to the right, and now it's going to turn to keep the localizer centered. And it's holding 3,000 feet for the active mode. When it captures the glide slope, then glide slope, which is armed, it's armed because it's white, will switch to green because that's the active mode. So we're coming up on the glide slope intercept. I'm going to go 1 notch of flaps, which can go down at a maximum speed of 110. We're below that. I'm going to put the view back here, and it looks like we're close to about 90 knots. Once the nose starts down, I'll have to pull the power back a little bit, otherwise we're going to accelerate as we descend if we keep the same power setting. So I'm going to go back to our view, and so this is about what it looks like, ballpark 6 miles out on an ILS approach to 3-2 right at Grant County International in visual conditions. Okay, we're coming up on glide slope intercept. There it is. The glide slope became the armed. We're speeding up because I didn't pull the power back, so I'm going to bring the power back a little bit. And I'm going to play with the power for a second. Now, in a diesel-powered airplane like this one, I'm not particularly expecting the engine to fail on an ILS approach, but, you know, Murphy's Law, these things can fail at the most inopportune times. And you're going to get a surprising takeaway from this particular lesson. So right now, we're just flying the approach. Everything's fine. Speed stable about 94, 95 knots. I'm going to bring the power back just a little bit, try to ease that back to 90. The autopilot is tracking the localizer very nicely. The autopilot is tracking the glide slope very nicely. Everything is looking great. And in normal operations, we would probably have some kind of a distance indicator the way most people would run this airplane. I'm not doing that. I'm just using the altitude and some mental calculations to calculate this. But we're ballpark because we're coming up on about 1,300 feet above the field elevation. That puts us roughly 4 miles out. So here we are. We're about coming up on 1,000 AGL. That would put us at about 3 miles out. And if the engine were to fail right now, I'm just telling you, any airplane configured for an approach where they're on a 3-degree glide slope, if they're more than about 2 miles out, I'm just going to tell you right now, I guarantee it right now, there is no way any airplane that ATC works, with maybe one exception somewhere, is ever going to be able to make it to the runway if the engine fails, which, darn it, it just did because I turned the engine master off here to simulate it. So first of all, I'm going to turn the autopilot off. So if you have somebody on an ILS approach, and they say that Mayday, Mayday, I lost the engine, I know our temptation is to clear them to land if we haven't done that already, but I'm just telling you right now, there is no way they're going to make the runway. It ain't going to happen, okay? Unless there happens to be another airport right next door or something, which does happen very rarely. I'm just telling you right now, they're going to land short. The only thing a controller can do is remind them, okay, trim for best glide speed, do not stall the airplane. Fly it under control all the way through the landing, and that's really all you can do. And then quietly just get the trucks rolling, okay, and get started on that process. But somebody loses an engine on a 3-degree glide slope on an approach, whether it's an ILS or an RNAV approach that's got like a 3-degree or so glide slope, there is no way they're going to make the runway. I'm just going straight ahead, and you're going to see, I mean, we're going to end up well short. I'm not particularly concerned with sticking the landing here in this field. You get the idea. But the idea is they are going to land short. One of the takeaways is if you have somebody with an engine failure, or, and I'm just going to end it here, and I'm going to mute it, and I'm going to go to the PowerPoint, so we're never going to know how that flight was going to end up. And I'm going to go to the final slide as I sort of wrap up here. If we ever have somebody with a partial engine failure or a rough running engine, which we're not really modeling at this point, but if somebody has a rough running engine and it's instrument conditions, so we get them set up for something like a normal instrument approach, be it RNAV or ILS, something like that, those approaches normally are done at the 3-degree glide slope, and a partial engine failure, as far as I'm concerned, it always has the chance of becoming a total engine failure. So what happens if you have somebody with a rough running engine and you set them up for a normal approach, so they've come across the final approach fix, they're tracking the ILS, and then that rough running engine suddenly gives up the ghost and fails completely? We've just condemned them to land 2 miles or so short of the airport. That creates a real dilemma for us. Do we bring them in high on an instrument approach? A lot of us are going to be worried about the liability on that. That one's tough. So right now I'm not going to give you my full thoughts on that. I am going to suggest that we really have to bring them in a little high, but man, I'm just telling you right now, no matter what you do, it's like Murphy's Law. If you bring them in on the approach, it's Murphy's Law that the engine's going to fail and they're going to be 2 miles short. If you bring them in high, the engine's going to keep running the whole time, and now they're high on the approach. So for now, I'm just going to kind of plant the bug that creates a real dilemma. But I did want to demonstrate here that on a 3-degree glide slope, you lose the engine 3 or 4 miles out, there is no way you're making the runway. All right, finally, feel free to experiment yourself. Grab any of the single-engine piston-powered airplanes. If you grab a diesel-powered one like this one, the DA40 TDI, if you fail the engine, you just have to turn off the engine master switch. Experiment. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. So if you try to go into a 2,500-foot strip, and you land short, you're going to learn some lessons, and it wouldn't surprise me if you find you're pulling on the yoke or the stick, you know, as you're in your home sim setup, whatever, and you're going to find that, oops, you were trying to stretch the glide. So I actually don't want you to make mistakes, but when you make them, don't be afraid and try to learn from them. For the approximate best glide speed for the wide variety of aircraft in the sim, for each of these airplanes, just use a speed roughly 5 to 10 knots below the top of the white arc, and that's going to be close enough for our purposes for now. I'll be posting more sample videos soon, and so you can continue to learn from those. So thank you. I hope you learned some lessons from this and the other videos about engine failures for the ultimate purpose of better assisting pilots experiencing in-flight emergencies. Thank you.